Thank you so much for joining us for our male survivors panel. I'm Elle, I'm the director of content here for PAVE, and we are so glad to have you here tonight for this important conversation about male survivors and their experiences, overcoming stigma, and healing from sexual violence. As always, we want to start with a content warning that this panel will be discussing issues related to sexual violence, and if you become activated at any point during the presentation, we have a plethora of resources on survivors.org. And this webinar will be recorded and shared later. So if you need to step away and come back to it later, it will be available for you. So first, I'm going to introduce our amazing host, Antoine. Antoine's a PAVE ambassador, affectionately known as Magic. He gave his first TED Talk in March 2018. He's also spoken at the United States Merchant Marine Academy and at other conferences for the Offices of Victim Services in Albany, New York. As a survivor of child sexual abuse, he's an advisory council member, advocate, speaker with the Offices of Services in New York against sexual assault and abuse, and volunteers with the Live Out Loud of New York as an openly gay role model for LGBTQIA+ youth. So thank you so much, Antoine. We're so excited to have you, and take it away.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm so happy and honored to be here this evening to kind of host this wonderful panel. And I just want to get to introducing our guest that I'll be having a conversation with tonight. So, Tim, please take a few moments to introduce yourself.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Tim Lennon. I go by he and him. I am survivor of childhood sexual abuse. I was raped and abused by my parish priest when I was 12. What was significant was that I buried those memories, some memories for over 30 years, and the most violent memories for up to 50 years. I had the good fortune of in contact with SNAP, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. I began working with them in 1990. And when the more violent memories came forward, 50 years after my abuse, I engaged with SNAP almost full time, up and including some time as national leadership. So I've been a strong advocate approaching 30 years. And I think it's incredibly important that when survivors speak up, they provide an opportunity for others that are silent to step forward as well. When I came forward over 50 years after my abuse, I went back to Iowa where I was abused, and 12 other people stepped forward. And we found with a gymnast or with Weinstein or any of these others, when one steps forward, hundreds step forward. So when we as survivors step forward, we provide an opportunity to say, you're not alone, me too. And that provides a great amount of solidarity, and that there are organizations to help. So I have been committed as a local leader and participating with SNAP's support groups for almost 30 years. We'll continue to do that on a monthly basis. I have more things to share, but for an introduction, that's for me. And thank you, Antoine.
Thank you so much, Tim. And thank you so much for the time you have given to this, both of yourself and to others. So I look forward to speaking more with you. Next up, we have Yona. So please introduce yourself to the group.
Thank you, Antoine, and thank you, PAVE, for hosting this really important webinar. So my name is Yona. I go by he, him, his pronouns, and I am a survivor of childhood sexual abuse that occurred when I was in elementary school and middle school in a religious school that I went to. It started when I was 10 or 11. I don't have all the memories, and there were instances of abuse, there were instances of rape, there were instances of gang rape, and there was a bunch of, and the violence occurred over several years. And at 14 years old is sort of when I decided to repress everything and not talk about it and sort of like pretend or act as if it didn't happen, which of course just made things more difficult. Fast forward to 2015, I had what I now recognize was a panic attack due to a case in my community that got a lot of media exposure about someone who is well known, who was accused of being, a rapist, and everyone was saying it's impossible for him to have done it because he's well known. And I'm like, that sort of triggered me. And that sort of prompted me to reach out and start seeking support and talking about it. And once I realized that I was not alone and that it happened to so many of us from all walks of life, I I made it my life's mission that no matter what I do, this will always be a part of it in speaking up for survivors and letting survivors know that you have a voice. You deserve to be heard. You deserve to be empathized with, not patronized. And there are people who will support you, who will help get you through this. And that for myself and so in terms of advocacy work, I've been doing it on an ad hoc basis, just people who know me, but different organizations local to Brooklyn, New York. And I've started doing some national things. I'm working for RAIN, for the National Sexual Assault Hotline. I just think it's just super, super, super critical that when a survivor is brave enough to reach out and seek support and talk about it, they need to be listened to. They need to be empowered. And I'm hoping through this webinar and other opportunities that survivors truly feel heard. Other than that, the most important thing about me is that I'm a father of 4 children and I like coffee.
Thank you so much, Yona. Oh, very excited for this conversation today. Next up, we have Jeff. Jeff, please.
Thanks, Antoine. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Dion. I use he, him pronouns. I'm based in Northern Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C., and I serve as the CEO of Zero Abuse Project. We are a nonprofit that's dedicated to eliminating all forms of child abuse and child sexual assault. And we train prosecutors, law enforcement, forensic interviewers, social workers. We also have survivor services. One of our programs is 1 in 6, which focuses on male survivors of abuse. We also have an online portal called Survivor Space, which provides resources and peer support to survivors of sexual abuse. I'm an attorney, a victim advocate, and a survivor of sexual abuse. I was abused when I was 7 and again when I was 15. And I've spent the last 25 years working in victim services. And I'm delighted to be here with all of you this evening.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Next up, we have Steve. Steve, please take a few moments and introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you, Antoine. Thank you, everybody, for joining the panel, my fellow panelists. It's remarkable, the strength and courage and bravery and commitment. And I applaud all of you. And my story is similar in terms of the age. I was sexually abused by a much older teenage male neighbor who was very close to our family and took advantage of that relationship and trust and violated over a period of years. I didn't tell anyone for about a decade. So I just lived with shame, silence, and blame. I don't even know if I really recognized what had happened to me or processed how damaging it was. But in my early 20s, I did disclose to a couple of members of my family, my immediate family. And I don't know if it was the time. I was one of 7 children, 6 boys and a girl right in the middle, but there was no compassion, no empathy. My parents, very good and decent people, just had no idea what to do. So it wasn't a case where anybody didn't believe me. It just felt like they didn't care. And I was left alone. At one point, several years later, they had actually invited my abuser's parents to my brother's wedding, and I didn't even know. And that's kind of and again, they're very good people. They're just the awareness and the ability to actually hold 2 things to be true, which is that people can do bad things, was just not something that they were accustomed to. So in any event, just coincidentally, I was searching on LinkedIn. I've been in financial services for 30 years. I really haven't leaned into this part of my story until a chance encounter with Alex Prout, the co-founder of I Have the Right To. within a conversation or two at 52 years old, as I'm sure many folks on the panel and the webinar know, the average age of disclosure for sexual assault victims, I felt like it was given a new life. I almost immediately was able to shake free of the shame and blame that had really shackled me for 3 or 4 decades. I'm now serve on the board of I Have the Right To, and participate in their incredible mission to provide for education free from sexual assault and sexual violence. So we speak at middle schools and high schools, including my own now twice, which was a very cathartic experience for me. So thank you for having me on the panel to PAVE. I really look forward to this conversation, and I'm really, really thrilled that so many people are committed to this work over decades, and new people are getting involved every day, and look forward to that world free from sexual assault.
Thank you so much, Steve. Wow. Okay. So I'll share a little bit of my own story before, as we get into our first question of conversation. And so for me, I had two separate instances. The first was around 7 or 8, and it was two family members. It was sort of a one-off. And then the second was several years later, about the age of 14. And it was a man who was essentially the super of the house my mother was renting. He would fix the things in the house. And I didn't speak about it to anyone for a very long time. And as I got into college and started to explore my sexuality as a gay man, all of these things started to come up. Just the need for control, physical and sexual control that I had, the inability, the chosen inability in some ways, of not wanting to be vulnerable emotionally with people, even to with friends in some instances. Um, just the fear that if I were vulnerable, then it would make me somehow weak or susceptible to the misuse of others. And it wouldn't be until the age of 30 when I would seek actual counseling, because I actually learned it existed. I had moved to New York from a small town, a small suburban town in Missouri, and I had two gay male friends in college. We all knew that the others were survivors. We all moved to New York to pursue our careers in musical theater and or dance. And one of those friends had been looking for services and found the Crime Victims Treatment Center here in New York City. And that's where he started. And he lovingly and wonderfully informed the other two of us about this location, about this center. And maybe about a year later, I was actually able to go to the center and seek help. And it was one of the best decisions I've made in my life. I've often said that I don't know when I would have found the healing I was able to find if I had not found the Crime Victim Treatment Center, because they were able to guide me through all the things that I needed to be guided through and support me in a way that I didn't know at the time was possible for me to be supported, to find love for myself, to forgive myself, to not have blame. And so I'm so thankful for the many organizations that exist in this country that are doing the work to help each and every one of us. And I am so happy to be the host of this panel this evening for this conversation. And so I just want to get us into our first question. So you see, it reads, why is it so important to hear the voices of male survivors? And we've inadvertently kind of answered this question in our introductions, but if there are any other thoughts that come to mind, we're going to touch on those. So I first would like to start with Yona. So what are your thoughts to this question? How would you, one or two pieces as to why it's important to hear the voices of male survivors?
Thank you. And this is, I think for me, it is the critical question, because so how survivors heal from their experiences is going to be different depending on so many factors. But before a survivor can heal, they need to feel that being heard. How can we support the survivor? What kind of support do you need? What kind of support do you want? Sometimes they're not, we're not ready to go to therapy or, deal with, those kinds of things. sometimes just being in a support group, right? So really hearing the survivor and empowering them, giving them their consent back. And, as a male, sexual violence is very often, just when we think of sexual violence, we automatically think of women, and that is unfortunately very true and very common.
Yes.
However, men are survivors, and men could be survivors from men. They can be survivors from women. They can be survivors when they were younger and they were older. So amplifying all of our stories, especially ones that can and has been marginalized, is super critical. So because every survivor deserves to be heard, listened to, and supported. And we can't do that until we hear them out. So for me, that was the key to my healing journey, is to first, I felt heard. So yeah.
Very true. Thank you so much for that. And the sirens of New York agree with you. Tim, what thoughts do you have to share for this question?
Well, I think Yona made a wonderful introduction. But to me, one of the crises of sexual violence of men and women is that most never report. And we know that maybe 70% of people that are sexually abused never step forward. And it might be because of a stigma that is attached to that. But we do know that it's a silent kind of epidemic. And that points to how our voices, when we step forward, provide an opportunities for others to say, it's not just me, that it's all of us, and that just the importance of knowing that so many are harmed by sexual abuse that never step forward. And there has to be a mechanism for saying it's okay, make it safe.
I agree. Thank you so much, Tim. And Steve, what thoughts would you add to this?
I think they've captured a lot of it. One of the things I think about, and one of the panelists mentioned it earlier, that 1 in 6 men have been abused at some point in their life. And as we noted, 1 in 4 for women. So, the estimates would be 30 plus million survivors, which greater than every state other than California. And I don't think that people think about it in those terms. They hear stories, they're isolated, and you move on. So until it's kind of recognized as the epidemic that it is, it's not going to get the attention that it deserves. And telling the stories is a way to bring that out. And the last thing I would add is just telling all of our stories. It's very different. A lot of the stories I heard certainly 20 years ago were about abuse in the Catholic Church and other organizations, Boy Scouts, other types of formal institutions. That's not what happened to me. What was done to me was isolated in the neighborhood, one-on-one. And it wasn't until kind of a lot of things clicked that I realized that I was part of that number. I am part of that survivor community.
Yes, I resonate with that very much. Thank you so much, Steve. And Jeff, what are some thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, I think it's important that male survivors' voices are heard, because one of the foundational principles of abuse is isolation. Victimization is isolating. Abusers isolate their victims. This is something that happens in secrecy. They tell us not to tell anybody. They attach shame to it, so we won't tell anybody. And because of this isolation, we think nobody else could possibly understand what it is that I'm going through. And so survivors feel very alone. But so it's so important that they hear a diversity of stories from different types of survivors and different types of experiences, so that they know, oh, I'm not the only one. This is like me, whether it's I'm not the only one who was abused by this person, or I'm not the only one who was abused by an older juvenile. I think all of those things are important. We did a lot of work when we were after the New York Child Victims Act was passed, which opened up the civil statute of limitations for child sex abuse, we did about 25 forums around the state talking to people to help them understand the dynamics of abuse and what their remedies might be. And I heard from so many different people that everybody thought that what happened to them was so unique, but there was so much commonality. And people thought that their understanding of their abuse was so tied to their race, to their ethnicity, to their gender, that you'd hear people share stuff and it's like, well, I'm Italian and we call that not sharing your dirty laundry, right? And someone else says, oh, well, in our family, we don't talk about it either. We call it this. So I'm seeing all these connections that people are experiencing the same things, but they think it's so unique to them. And so let's give people a diversity of faces, a diversity of ages, so that they can find other people that they relate to. Just like Steve, I was in my 20s before I recognized that what happened to me counted as abuse. I was in law school and I remember reading a book, and because I thought, well, I wasn't abused by a priest or a little league coach or something. And so, that doesn't count. But then when I read it, I realized it did. And I think there is a certain trajectory to a person's path of recovery where there are a number of profound moments. The first is when they name it, when they realize that what happened to them counted. And that's the first time. And then the next time is when they realize, oh, what it's done to them, like how they've been harmed because of that, and the price that they paid. And so I think all of these things are really important so that people know that they're not alone and that there's help available.
Yes, I could not agree more. And in my own experience, I later found out that my mother and my two older sisters had also experienced sexual abuse and violence in their childhood, in their youths. And at times I've wondered, like, if I had known that, would I have said something sooner than I did at all? And so there is, an understanding not every individual will be able to speak to their truth, to their story, to their experience. But for those of us who might be able to, not only will it provide an opportunity for healing for ourselves, it can also provide such a wonderful opportunity of healing and connection for those who, as we've heard just in this question alone, feel isolated and to themselves. So now we're going to move on to our next question. And it is, how did people in your life respond to you coming forward as a survivor? And is there anything that you would like to have changed or wish they had done differently when they responded? So I'm going to first go to Steve, please.
Yeah, and I touched upon this a little bit earlier. I just want to connect this to something Jeff was just saying, is that not only did I not necessarily understand what was done and that it was abuse and that it was going to have a lifetime ramifications, I also felt responsible. And I think as kids, I'll just speak for myself, it may be similar for people who are older as well, but as kids, when you're groomed, when you're targeted in a way that makes you feel like you're special, you become what you feel like an accomplice. You feel like you're in this together. And I can't remember if it's what he said or not. It's possible. But I do remember, it's not like I wasn't dragged over to his house or into my basement. I went freely. And that is something that really took a long time for me to realize what was done to me to bring me into that orbit and make me feel like I was participating.
Yes.
So it was very, very important for me to get to the point to realize, well, wait a minute, no, this was all him. He took advantage of me. He took advantage of my family, the trust. And it was really very, very painful then to come forward and say, this was done to me. And I do want to acknowledge that I was just at my mom's funeral this weekend, and my family and I have built a much stronger relationship since my public disclosure in my 50s. And they were extremely supportive, including when his parents did also show up again as they were neighbors at my mom's service and reception. And as for how I wished it would happen, it's simply what I said from the beginning. Just it did. I got a second chance, and that was interacting with Alex and just feeling the love, the conveying of and accepting that I'm not alone, that we've all talked about, that it's not my fault, that I'm not responsible, and true healing is possible, which, by the way, at that point in my life, I just thought there was going to be this dead part of me that I was going to live with for the rest of my life. And thank God that's not the case.
That's wonderful. And sincerest condolences for the loss of your mother.
Thank you.
And yeah, so thank you so much for being here. All right, I'm going to go to Jeff.
I think that I remember when I told my parents, and it was all wrapped up in one thing. My abuse led to all sorts of stuff. And I had to go tell my parents all at once that I was gay, I was getting divorced, and it was because, and that I was abused as a kid. And they're like, but you
That's a
weren't.
big
And I'm
bucket
like,
for.
right. And I'm like, yes, I was. But I wasn't ready to talk more about that. Right.
Mhm.
And I think our conversation is so important for everybody else in the world, because one of the things we know is whenever someone discloses to that first person, however the very first person they tell reacts can determine whether or not they ever tell anyone else ever. I've had people, because all of this was sort of wrapped up and coming out at the same time. I had people say, "Oh no, you're not gay. You're just, re-perpetrating against yourself or something." I mean, it's just all sorts of crazy stuff. And I think we just want people to say, "I'm so sorry that that happened, and I wish I would have known, and how can I help?" And I think that's what our responses need to be. And I think every single one of us deals with that shame and that self-blame, because so often the abuse is not forced. Nobody, it happens, but it's very rare that someone is going to grab a kid and drag him someplace and force this to happen. Yes, it does happen, but more often than not, a child is coerced. They're groomed. It's someone they know, someone they trust. And so then the child feels to blame because you're saying, well, no one put a gun to my head and made me do this, right? And as someone who also experienced abuse at 2 separate times for years, it was so much easier for me to talk about and disclose the abuse that happened at 7, because when you're 7, everybody's bigger than you, and you sort of feel a little, you don't feel, you feel more blameless. When I'm 15, it's like, ooh, really? Shouldn't I have been more responsible? Shouldn't I have known what was going on? But I was being misled and duped by a scout leader. And, so I had to come to terms with that I should never have been put in that position, that, I was coerced into that. And I really have an awful lot of trauma, that lives as a result of that. And so I think part of it is there is a part of that path of healing is forgiving ourselves and absolving ourselves. And sometimes it's also about absolving others around us, not necessarily the perpetrator, but, things we wanted or needed from people in our lives that didn't give it to us because they didn't know and we didn't have the words to ask for what we needed. But I think our awareness has increased greatly. And, we've talked about, Steve mentioned how I think he was 52 when he disclosed, and that's sort of the average age. And the good thing is, and it's the average age for people our age, But one of the good things we're seeing is that we're bringing down that age of disclosure, which is so important, because until we disclose, none of that trauma gets resolved. And I say unresolved trauma is sort of like a wrecking, like your body's a pinball machine, but instead of a pinball bouncing around, it's a wrecking ball of trauma that's just bouncing around in your life and wreaking havoc. And you don't start to control that and you resolve that until you start to acknowledge it and get some help. And so the sooner we can get people to disclose this, then the sooner we can get them help, because the longer that wrecking ball continues inside, the more damage it causes. And we don't want, kids, one, we don't want kids to be abused. But two, if they are, we don't want them to suffer through 30 or 40 years of unresolved trauma when we know there are interventions and we can help.
Thank you, Jeff. Tim, please share some thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Antoine. I grew up in an Irish Catholic family. There's 12 of my family, 10 boys, 2 girls. And as I mentioned previously, I buried memories for many, many decades. And so I was in my 50s or so before before memories came forward and before I told any of my brothers and sisters. I told my parents, who were immediately outraged, but I don't believe we discussed anything after that. I told each of my brothers and sisters individually. I didn't want to make a grand announcement. I didn't want to make it a big deal, but I did tell them we were a very close family, or still are. And I told them individually, and I would say about half have been incredibly supportive for the last decade or so since I first disclosed to them. But the other half were kind of an immediate, that's too bad. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. And that was the end of the conversation. And it was like some people just don't have the ability to express any kind of sympathy. I mean, it's so horrific, it's so horrible, it's so out of the norm that in polite society, and we grew up in a very, very narrow Catholic kind of family, none of these things were ever discussed. So when I disclosed, I've got incredible support from 4 or 5 of my family, just absolutely incredible for decades. But some, they'll acknowledge it if the topic comes by in passing. But since the first disclosure till now, there's never been any kind of disclosure or any kind of discussion. So it's been sort of mixed, and I sort of understand that it's hard for people to talk about such cruelty to children. It's just so outside the norm. People can't comprehend it or can't understand it. And I'm sort of sympathetic to that. That's fine. That's where they are. That's who they am. Who they are.
Yes. Yes. And just before we go to Yona, I want to say to Tim and to our viewers, something that I've mentioned about when people choose to disclose to someone, and for those who may be watching this and or will watch this, who have not disclosed to someone, please do not let the fear that who you disclose to, that if they aren't welcome or will not be open, to keep you from speaking out. Look throughout the people close to you in your life and find someone. I am a firm believer that each of us has one person in our lives that will hear what we have to say without question and will be there to support us. So if you have not yet spoken about what is happening to you or what has happened to you, look at those closest to you, really get a sense of what that relationship is between the two of you. And when you are ready, do yourself a favor, give yourself the love and the push to tell just that one person. And if that's the one person you speak to about it for years, then let that person be the beginning of your support system and others will follow. So please don't let the fear of being left alone or being left isolated in what has happened to you keeping you silent. So we're going to go to Yona to get his response for this, and then we'll move to the next question. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, all of you, for the wonderful responses. Full disclosure, this is the question I have struggled with my whole life the most. I grew up in a very traumatic home environment, not of sexual violence. There was just a lot going on. But I was always an eager pleasing kid, you know, what they would call a goody two shoes, that sort of thing. And then I changed schools and elementary school, and I was nervous. I was the new kid. It was in the middle of the year, and I come from a traumatic environment, so I was always, you know, kept to myself, that sort of kid. And I didn't know I was ripe for abuse, but I think any child is ripe for abuse with predators. Um, but I had no understanding of what sex, like I had no sex ed. I had no understanding of what body parts are and what can happen. And certain physical reactions does not mean that you enjoyed it or that you liked it, and you know, and things like that. But there's one story that I've shared publicly that I'm going to share now that sort of highlights my experience in that when it clicked into my brain as a kid that I was being abused or that I was being taken advantage, because at first I thought it was love. You know, that's how it was conditioned to me. When I first realized, no, this isn't love and I'm not feeling okay and I need to tell someone. And, you know, like Antoine, you mentioned like telling someone, who's that one person. I did not feel comfortable telling my parents. So I figured, you know, tell my teacher. That was sort of like my default. I told my teacher, but I was not direct. I was being very, you know, beating around the bush. I was sort of like insinuating, you know, trying to put my hand around where certain things were happening. And I remember the moment it clicked in his brain, what I was saying and what I was insinuating. And essentially I was saying that another teacher who was acting as a default guidance counselor. He was not a guidance counselor, but he was sort of like the teacher that everyone went to who had emotional problems. When it clicked into his brain what I was saying, he slapped me across the face. And
Wow.
he said we don't talk about such things. That conditioning was not only because I know as a child I was like, do I talk, do I not talk? It wasn't just the violence, it was the conditioning of silence. And so that is a lot of my history and a lot of my trauma. And just if I talk about it at any age, it was always the question, because I knew I was abused when I was 19, 20, 21, 22. You know, it's not like at 33, all of a sudden I decided I remembered. But when I started speaking up, it was more about, will someone hit me if I say something? That was the constant thing. And how I wish anyone would have responded, just let me speak. Let me talk. Let me get it out. Let me share what I have to say, because it is a brave and courageous act to speak up. And again, I never had that opportunity. And the one other thing I wish people would do, and this is when I feel a little different about this now, when I have disclosed as an adult, I'm 43, I'm 42 now. I always get people responding to me based on how it impacts them. And the truth is, when I disclose to a loved one or to anyone that I'm a survivor, I get that it's going to impact them, because how can it not?
Right.
But if your sole response is how it impacts you and you have no compassion for me as a survivor, that's where my irkiness really gets up. So how I wish, don't be selfish. Don't be selfish.
Yeah, thank you, Yona. I hear that. And for anyone who has been disclosed to, it's, you know, I had a very close friend disclose their positive HIV status to me. And it's someone that I knew for a very long time. And I remember instantly saying to myself, this isn't about you. Let them know you are here for them and ask them what they need from you. And it is honestly that simple. I understand for people we love, we want to help, we want to make things better, we want to take action. And in that moment, the action that is needed is to listen. Say, say, thank you for trusting me to tell me this. How can I support you? And then follow the lead of the person who is disclosing to you. If you can allow yourself to do that, you will make the world, the person disclosing to you in, so much safer and so much warmer and so much more loving, just by offering those two questions, those two statements. I am so sorry to hear this. How can I support you? All right, let's move to our next question, please. All right, let's see this one. I'm very intrigued to hear the answers of this one and have a conversation around this one. So, how do traditional gender roles and toxic masculinity contribute to your ability to heal as a male survivor? Um, you know, I will speak to this one first, and then I'll move to our other panelist. Growing up, and once I was in college or middle of high school, understanding that I was attracted to other men, I was trying to come to terms with my sexuality, also coming to terms with my ethnicity as a Black man. And so I was asking myself so many questions. What kind of Black man am I? What kind of man am I? Because society was telling me, if you are a man, you have to look this way, act this way, speak this way, behave this way. And in the Black community, same things apply. Look this way, act a certain way, behave this way, speak a certain way. And so I didn't see myself in either of the identities, of those two identities, I'd say. And it led to such a judgment towards myself, of myself, and shame and fear of who I now am. And it took me many, many years and meeting other Black men, Black queer men that represented the things I was taught to fear in church and throughout society, and meeting them and seeing them be their beautiful and bold selves, to recognize there isn't any one or two ways to be. It's just who you are, figuring out who that is and to be that authentically. And so it has, there's such an amount of de-learning that is necessary, depending on what our social and religious upbringings are and our cultural upbringings are, to find who we are in the midst of what we have learned from the adults around us. And so, Yona, what would you add to this question?
So I grew up in an extremely ultra-Orthodox Jewish religious community, very Hasidic in Brooklyn, and there were only two roles. There were men roles and there were women roles, and it was very specific. And we learned this even as boys and girls, right, before we became, men and women. And one of those things where boys don't cry, boys don't have feelings, boys don't show emotion, right? And while I stuck to that paradigm until I was being abused, but once I started, was being abused and I was conditioned into silence, it was like I need to get it out somehow. So like there was a physical response to getting it out, and I would cry a lot. I would become very emotional, and things like that. And I was bullied about that.
Mm.
Like I was less of a man. And so that is boy, was I surprised to learn that no, being an emotional person and reacting to sexual violence does not determine your gender.
Mm-hmm.
Does not mean you're less of a man or more of a man. It just makes you human. And
Yes.
and also the sexuality portion is I am bisexual myself. And for the longest time, I had this real awful mindset that I'm not really bisexual, because how can I be bisexual if I was traumatized by men? And I'm like, what does one have to do with the other? So by hearing more voices, again, going back to that thing and hearing people's experiences, I'm really, I've been ready for a long time, and I've been doing it for a little while, to buck the trends. Is there's no such, we need to go away with traditional gender norms, especially
Yes.
around this thing. So yeah.
Thank you, Yona. Thank you so much. Jeff.
Yeah, I think that, to build on what some of Yona said, yes, we are socialized with these gender roles about boys not crying, boys not being emotional. But the one emotion that was safe for boys and that was allowed was to be angry. And when that was the only option, we ended up with a lot of really angry men. And some of what they're angry about is this trauma. And to build on something that Antoine said at the beginning, Antoine, you talked about your need for control. And I think when we're holding things inside, and when we think we are existing in ways we're not supposed to exist, we're existing in ways that don't fit our gender or our race or our perceived sexuality, that we try and keep things in. And so there's a lot of control about who we're going to let in and what we're really going to let show. I've always said that the word victimization really just means that at some moment in time, someone else was in control. And for so many survivors, the process of recovery is about trying to regain that control. So that's why it's so common for survivors to sort of be control freaks and want to control things, because something happened when they weren't in control and it was pretty devastating. And so understanding that and understanding people's need for control. And one of the things in me that it led to was that trying that coping mechanism of trying to maintain control meant that I was living my life in a whole bunch of different boxes. And why everything sort of came to a head and came out all at once was because, as part of my recovery, I had to be one person and be true to that whole person, as a survivor, as a father, as a gay man, and all of that had to come together. And so I couldn't live in my little boxes anymore. And those walls had to come down so that everyone could see me for who I was and all the different parts of me that were part of my authentic self.
Thank you, Jeff. Steve, what would you add to this?
Yeah, I would add that toxic masculinity itself obviously leads to a lot of issues in society above and beyond sexual violence, but obviously this is a largely act committed by males. Not that it can't be or any gender, but the reality is it is part of that culture. And I think I go to what Jan was saying about whether you're able to do something as simple as cry or feel. I grew up in a family of 7, as I said, 6 boys, so 7 males. I went to all male high school. So I had, maleness all around me.
Yes, an abundance.
And there's beauty in it, but when it's restricted to these certain characteristics or feelings like anger or rage or humor, we're all very, very limited. And I think of what Jeff said earlier about the ping pong ball or the wrecking ball inside. That can come just from not being your full self. And that's what, one of the things that I think that toxic masculinity contributes to. So I think in my case, it was very much an inability to access my feelings, and nobody asked me, right? That's another thing where it can come from within and from without. So I think that it's just really, really important to, again, I agree with destroying those gender, not just stereotypes, but those behaviors, and allow us all to be the fully human selves we're meant to be. And I'll just note one thing, which I guess I find it funny, but it's probably pretty sad, but I'm still figuring out what emotions are, which is I just learned what a feelings wheel was 2 years ago from another survivor.
Actually, when you saying it, I don't think that I actually know what a feelings wheel is. So please enlighten us.
We'll get you one, but there's something like 60 emotions.
Mm.
I thought there was happy and sad and some,
Right.
deviations on that. But yeah, it is remarkable things like surprise and other types of, I'm like, wow, these are emotions, so, the reality is I probably did have a lot of things that experienced a lot of things on that wheel. I just didn't know how to identify it or articulate it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Steve. All right, Tim, anything else you would like to add?
Yeah, we're running close to time, so I'll just briefly say that I didn't recognize them myself, and maybe someone from the outside will have a different view, but I didn't think that the toxic masculinity I was so beat down as a kid, and because I had buried memories for decades, I was constantly bedeviled by low self-esteem. So there was not much me out in the world. It was only as I became, and we've sort of used this term, my true self, and this was at 63 through EMDR therapy, that I was
Wow.
actually to become the person and not have my past control me. So I never saw that as an issue in my experience, mostly as just low self-esteem.
Hmm. Thank you so much, Tim. That is such a very astute and beautiful insight to oneself. And as we move to our next question, which I think would be our final question, I just want to point out to our viewers and our audiences something that is a commonality with each of us on this panel is that in the process of us finding our healing, we have done so through grace, through love, curiosity. I'm sure in that there were times where we were fighting with ourselves, against ourselves, whatever that might have been. But at the end of the day, there was been such a curiosity and a comfort and appreciation and love for that part of us that was taken advantage of in order for us to find healing from that. And I think that is such a wonderful message for all of us to hear, and especially men to hear. You don't have to fight and be at war in order to heal. It isn't about overpowering or controlling the elements of your life, the people in your life, or even your emotions and feelings. Allow those things, give space to those things, give love to those things, and healing will come from that. And so with that, taking us into our closing question, are there any words of encouragement or support that any of you gentlemen would like to add or to offer our male survivors? So we'll start with Tim.
Oh, good, because this is my favorite question of all the questions. And that is to the men and to all victims of sexual abuse is that our movement is winning. In other words, survivors are winning. The fight against sexual violence in society, it is my belief that with the creations of hundreds of survivor organizations in the last 20 years, that we've created a social movement akin to the women's movement or the civil rights movement. And this is my soapbox. I have a website, standupspeakup.org, but the idea is based on the are building a new movement, and we've seen a number of different kinds of coalitions circling around Keep Kids Safe or the Me Too movement organization. So there's different kind of alliances and groups. So I think that we're on the winning side. We haven't won, but to give us a positive note to end this.
Thank you, Tim. Next, I'll go to Jeff.
Thanks, Antoine. First, I want to say that I'm a big believer in support groups in all sorts of different forms, just because it gives us an opportunity to interact with other survivors and maybe learn from their experience. What are the things that help them? I might be in a support group with Steve and say, look, Steve looks like he's got his act together. How is Steve doing this? And I feel like my life is falling apart. And so Steve can model, resilience and offer hope. And there's a lot of ways to get that. Through our program 1 in 6, we have 5 weekly anonymous online support groups for male survivors. It's a great entry. If you've never told anyone, you can log into the support group and just listen anonymously or share, and no one's going to know. And that might be your first step to normalizing or coming to terms with the things you're feeling. Also on the 1 in 6 website is the Bristlecone Project, which is a series of portraits and videos of a diverse array of male survivors, and that we hope model some resilience and offer hope to people. And Antoine, you talked about encouraging people to find that one person in your life that you can tell. And I think of what we teach children in our prevention education curriculum, that every child should have a safety net of 5 trusted individuals, 5 trusted adults that they can go to with anything. And why do we have 5? Because if you go to 1 and they're not listening, then there's someone else that you can go to talk to. And so to never give up and find that one person that you can talk to. And if you don't like their response, then go find someone else, because I guarantee someone is going to be willing to listen and help and let all these survivors know they're not alone.
Thank you, Jeff. Yona, you're up.
Such an important question, and one of the ones I like speaking about the most, because as I mentioned, I was conditioned into silence, and I took a risk and speaking up, and when I first felt heard, it was almost intoxicating, and I couldn't get enough of it. So my words of encouragement or to other male survivors, just watching this webinar is step 1. Telling a therapist could be step 1. There's no right or wrong way to taking that first step. I'm a big fan of support groups, because support groups, I don't always have to talk about it, but I can feel company, right? And there are support groups that are for men. There are support groups for certain, backgrounds. So whatever makes you feel comfortable, that's sort of, yeah. And finally it's very cliche, because I've heard it being said to me so many times, so I kind of feel funny even saying it. But the fact that you survived what you did makes anything you do, gives you have a certain amount of strength that you may not realize. And I want to acknowledge that it's not easy, but it is so well worth it. And there are hundreds, thousands, and millions of survivors and allies out there who will listen to you, who will support you, and most importantly, who will believe you. And
Yes.
If we could start with that one, that's when we can really build on that.
Thank you, Yona. Steve.
Yeah, absolutely. The first therapist I went to in my 20s, part of an HMO, I went in, and it was a very brief conversation, because it ended when he said, if you're not ready to talk, maybe you can come back when you are ready. So I had a number of occasions with unhelpful and destructive responses that could have shut me down for good. They did shut me down for a while, no doubt, but don't give up. Keep talking to people. As the Prouts said to their wonderful and courageous daughter, Chessie, when she disclosed, you are not alone. It's not your fault. True healing is possible, and don't stop until you find that person or people who are going to say that. And one of the things I'm a big believer in, Alex has had a unbelievable impact on my life. It was a peer conversation. Out of the I Have the Right To website, there is a collaboration we're doing with peers.net, which allows people, particularly young people and students, to connect with people with similar experiences. And in my case, that's what my initial disclosure was to somebody who disclosed. And I find every time I disclose, there are scores of people who disclose to me. So they are out there. Find a peer and get the help that you deserve.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Steve. I want to thank Steve, Yona, Jeff, and Tim for taking the time to be on this panel. Thank you for the work that you're doing, not only for others, but also for yourself. And I'm sure that part of the work that you do for others is because you have done the work for yourselves. I want to thank PAVE for making this possible, for having this be a resource for future viewers. I want to thank each individual that was here for us and with us tonight, and for any of those who will tune in and watch this in the future. And just lastly, as I close this out, I want each and every one of us to know, and this is something I say often, that you are loved and you are loved, not because of anything you have done or anything you haven't done, but because you're human. And we need to hear that. As you see on the screen, we have different services available to you, resources. And again, you can find all of these at survivors.org. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. Please be well in each day that you take. And as you close out of here, play some nice music for yourself. If you drink alcohol, have that. If you love coffee, make yourself an espresso. Whatever that little treat is that you can give to yourself tonight for being here and being present with us, please do that for yourself. And again, thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, a wonderful week. Take care.
Great. Thank you. Good talking with all of you. Bye now.
Take care, everyone. You are all worthy.
Thank you, Antoine.
You're welcome.